How much protein do women athletes need? A very common question. And if you're like many of my listeners, your personal answer is probably more than I'm currently getting, but not quite sure the fine details and how to make it really happen. This is the first in a multi-episode series on protein intake. And today we're going to be answering that question. How much protein do women athletes need? Why is it important? And how much do you need specifically for muscle building activity? Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being with me today. Very excited about this topic because if there's something I could talk about all day long within the realm of sports and performance nutrition, it is why protein is so damn important and how to work on increasing your protein intake, because it really does matter. And also, there's just kind of a lot of numbers floating around out there, and it tends to stress people out. So I hope that by the end of this podcast today, this first in a series about protein, you'll be a little bit less stressed and be able to go out into your life with a little bit more certainty about how much protein you should be shooting for across your day. But before we dive into all the details, a couple things. First of all, hit that subscribe button on your podcast app. It is such an important thing. I very much appreciate it. And it is a very simple way to show your love and appreciation for the Fuel Your Strength podcast. And also, if you are somebody who's ready to go all in on your performance, on your results in terms of strength, muscle, and energy, and really your performance in and out of the gym, and you're ready to put it together in a synergistic system that works, all the pieces work together, you want faster results for your efforts, and you want to do it with coaching and support, then go ahead and submit an application for Strength Nutrition Unlocked. We want to help you take your training to the next level, to take your results from good to great. So go ahead and apply over at stephgaudreau.com/apply. All right. So as I said, this is the first in a multi-part series all about protein. And we're going to be getting into a lot of detail here. So as I said in the last episode, oftentimes we speak in these cute little taglines like eat more, not less, or eat more protein, those sorts of things. And yeah, it's a quick way to get the point across. However, two things. There is nuance in this as always. And secondly, adult learners need to understand the why, the rationale, if you're going to accept and start to apply what you are learning. So yeah, Instagram Reels are like a cute 5-second way to get a point across, but we really need to go more into depth. And frankly, you deserve that as a female athlete. You deserve to know the information, like the science-based, evidence-backed information. All right. So on this podcast, we're going to be looking more at the why and how much, and then we'll get into other topics in future episodes to come in this series. So when it comes to nutrition and fueling your athletic pursuits, I would say most listeners, most people out there, most athletic women have an inkling that they need more protein, especially if you haven't been trying to increase your protein intake. So you're like, yeah, I know, I need more protein. And it's not the easiest thing to do. And I'm going to lay it out there right now for you. It's not the easiest thing to make a consistent effort to get a higher range of protein intake, although I think there's a lot to be said for nudging it up over time. If somebody tries to tell you tomorrow that you should, particularly if you have a low protein intake, that you should just double what you're eating, they're full of shit, because you're not going to realistically be able to do that. It doesn't just involve putting the fork or the food to your mouth. It also includes things like your shopping habits, your food prep habits, what you have on hand, how you're used to cooking, and what you're used to buying. There's just a lot that goes into this. So I'm a huge fan of the take small steps over time. That way, all of the systems and structures and habits and environment around you will be able to nudge slowly without this big dramatic change. And then you're like, I couldn't do this. This sucks. I'm going to go back to the way I was doing things. And so just kind of listen to this with an open mind. I would say typically when my clients come in, my students come into Strength Nutrition Unlocked, there's like 2 or 3 main areas that they tend to struggle with the most coming in. The first one is they're just not eating enough throughout the day. They are skipping meals quite often because their schedule is chaotic, and they tend to fall into the within day energy deficit category that we talked about in the last podcast. Secondly, they're not eating enough protein, and they just oftentimes don't know. Like, we just don't know, like, how much protein do we really need? Not just in grams, y'all, but then how do we translate that to servings and like what goes on the plate or what we drink? Like, it does take time to learn how to translate quantities into real life habits. All right. And the third one is carbohydrate intake. Is just sort of like you're eating enough overall caloric energy, but just way, way, way too low in carbs. And, you know, carbs and fats, we have some leeway in terms of the amounts and the proportions. But suffice to say, if you're just barely eating any carbohydrates and then going out and doing intense training, you're not going to feel very good. And so we're talking about lifting heavy weights, doing high intensity training, pushing those runs a little bit faster, doing your harder Peloton rides, those sorts of things. So oftentimes my students and clients will come in and they're just not recovering really well. They have a lot of muscle soreness, like a disproportionate amount of muscle soreness, especially if you're doing training that is you're not doing much that's really new. And especially if you are predominantly doing, I would say, a lower volume style of training. So really kind of those typical strength rep ranges, 5, 6, 7 or less, somewhere in that range. If you're really, really sore all the time, you can't figure out why, or have persistent injuries or things that won't heal, it's really difficult for you to keep muscle mass on, or you're just like, shit, I am like lifting my fucking face off here and I am not building very much muscle mass. What is going on? Lack of overall training progress and sort of the struggle to put up the intensity that you really need to get results from your training. So oftentimes people will do more and more and more. A lot of these can be indicators for protein intake being too low. Of course, there are other issues that could be at play. So we really need to be conscious of protein as the macromolecule of building. Yes, protein, specifically certain amino acids, can be used for energy production, but this hopefully is not a predominant thing that we're relying on, because there is nothing more frustrating than working really hard to build muscle mass and then not eating very much. So then you break down that muscle in order to create fuel. So we really are kind of separating the idea of protein on one side and then carbohydrates and fats on the other. So think about protein as your macromolecule of building. Proteins, specifically the amino acids that we consume and then we can also make, have many different functions and roles in the body. Everything from, of course, yes, building muscle protein, contractile protein, through skin, hair, nails, enzymes, antibodies, so on and so forth, right? So we know we need to consume protein, specifically really need to consume the essential amino acids, of which there are 9. And we will be talking a little bit more about some of these amino acids, in particular, one of our superstar essential amino acids, in a future episode. So stay tuned for that. So just to give you that awareness, and then also to remind you that we cannot synthesize, the body cannot synthesize those essential amino acids. They are absolutely crucial for muscle protein synthesis, and we need to eat them. We can't just store them like we can store glucose in our muscle or our liver in the form of glycogen, or we can store triglycerides and fats in the form of adipose tissue. We can't just like take all this, quote unquote extra protein and store it somewhere for later, or in this case, we're talking about amino acids. There are some, I guess what would be called transient pools of amino acids in the body, but we need to eat protein on a regular basis so that we can keep the process of muscle protein synthesis going. So it's really, really important, especially as we are progressing through our 40s and aging and going through the process of the menopause transition. So perimenopause into postmenopause, because we are losing that estrogen signal, which is a really amazing anabolic signal. Yes, we can still build muscle. We can still offset that, but we really need to have resistance training and adequate protein intake. And we're going to talk more about all of that other stuff in future episodes, like kind of the practicalities and the nuts and bolts of that. But first, we're going to turn our attention to the idea of, are we eating enough total protein? So first and foremost, when it comes to muscle repair, muscle recovery, and growth, yes, we do need to be kind of thinking about overall total protein intake. In other words, it is not uncommon for female athletes who are trying to build strength and muscle to be eating less than, I would say, half or a little bit more than half of the recommended amount of protein that you need each day. Some people get really worried about what kinds of protein are the best, how much you should have before or after a workout. So we're kind of setting the priority here that, yes, there is some nuance with distribution of protein. Yes, there is nuance with protein type and quality and timing around workouts. However, if you're not eating enough protein, you're not eating enough protein, no matter how you slice and dice it and divide it up. So that's very, very important. If you, let's say you require somewhere between 100 and 120 grams of protein a day, but you're consistently eating less than 60 grams, then it doesn't terribly matter much how much you're dividing that across the day. In other words, taking an already small intake and thinning it out even more, eating it in small bits here and there, tends to work against you when it comes to building and repairing muscle tissue and building strength. So historically speaking, total protein recommendations have been given as a relative percentage of total calories, generally between the range of 15 and 25% of daily energy intake. However, there is an absolute requirement for protein. So calculating your needs using a percentage of calories can lead to wildly varying numbers. And I do see still many women, especially before they come into Strength Nutrition Unlocked, calculating a percentage of protein based on a far inadequate amount of daily calories. So for example, to put some numbers on it, let's say you've calculated that you're going to eat 1,200 calories in a day. Not suggesting this. Do not get any ideas. But just for numbers' sake, 15% of 1,200 calories then translated into grams, knowing that protein is 4 calories or kilocalories per gram, would be about 45 grams of protein. So 15% of 1,200 calories turned into grams would be about 45 grams of protein. This is a very different amount if you're considering a 2,500 calorie intake requirement. So if you calculated 15% of 2,500, which is not out of the realm of practicality for someone who's training very hard, or if you're trying to build mass and be in a slight caloric surplus for a short period of time, that would be about 95 grams of protein. Okay, so both of them are 15%, but the total caloric intake is widely varying here. And I do see that women tend to far underestimate their caloric needs. And again, we're talking in the context, you are athletic, you are active, you are not sedentary, you need more energy. So sometimes we see that if you use just a straight up percentage, you are not calculating enough protein. So when your calorie intake drifts lower and lower, then trying to use this relative percentage approach could mean under eating protein and then, of course, consequently, under eating overall energy. So there is thankfully a growing acceptance and growing evidence that the commonly cited and referred to recommendation of the RDA for protein is insufficient for almost everyone in the population, and certainly for athletic individuals, including you, an athletic woman over the age of 40. And that amount is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. That is the RDA. It is considered the minimum to prevent deficiency. It is not the optimal amount. It is not the amount that you need to support the added, what I would call, demands of training. And there is a growing call to increase the RDA for sedentary individuals. Okay, so we have a couple of different numbers here, and this is where we're going to start to see ranges coming into play. I prefer with my students and my clients to work off of a range, because just like anything else, we can get too stressed out or start feeling anxious that we're not hitting the exact amount, and no one needs that. No one needs to feel more anxious about trying to eat an optimal amount of protein and knowing that some days you might fall a little bit lower, a little bit higher. And then hopefully we're going to be shooting for moving toward the higher end of the range, but you also might be far below where you need to be. So just calculating the top end of the range and then stressing the fuck out about it is not what we want to do, my friend. All right. So it might be for you that you're going to shoot toward the lower end of the range, and that's fine. Again, we have to just start where we're at and slowly improve it over time. And that's okay. This is not something to get all twisted up into a pretzel about. All right. So moving beyond the RDA, there are a couple of things I'm going to talk about here. So the American College of Sports Medicine recommends a range of 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And most of the, what I would say, performance and sports nutrition research available right now points to a total daily protein requirement between 1.4 and up to, in some cases, 3.0 grams per kilogram body weight per day, depending on specific goals, health status, whatever you're trying to do with your training. I would say for most of my students and most of you out there listening, 3 grams is going to be very, very high. So again, if you're calculating where you're at now and then you see 3 grams per kilogram body weight, you're going to be like, yeah, okay, that's not going to happen. So it can be possible though. So just kind of know that I would say most of my female athletes that I work with, we're not going to go up quite that high. Just a side note, and this is not what this podcast focuses on. However, I know some of you are going to keep this in the back of your mind. If you are undergoing a short-term energy deficit for fat loss reasons, you must. And this is something I don't want to go too far into it because I don't want this podcast and my coaching to be known for this, but this is a cautionary tale. You must keep protein intake on the higher side and do resistance training to minimize losses in lean muscle mass. The worst thing you can do is cut your calories drastically, keep your protein low, and fail to strength train. We do not want you to do that. Okay. So I would say most of my students get really great results with a daily protein goal of somewhere between 1.4 to 2.0 grams per kilogram body weight per day as a range. Again, some days you're probably going to do better. Some days you're not. That's all right. We are going to talk about in future episodes how that really actually breaks down meal wise and what that would look like. So this is a general range, and where you ultimately sit on this will depend on a couple of things. Some people like to use total body weight. Some people prefer to use a lean mass estimation. If you are a larger body weight individual, who's carrying more fat mass, you may want to shoot toward the lower end of the range. Again, there's going to be variation here, and how we exactly help customize is going to depend on a lot of different factors. But suffice to say, if you are falling far short of even 1.4 grams per kilogram body weight per day, which in I just realized I didn't say it in pounds, we're talking about 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound a day. I know some of us don't speak metrics, so that's what we're thinking about there. So there is going to be fluctuation. There is variation. So what about specifically for us as female athletes? Now that 1.4 to 2.0 grams per kilogram body weight does come from and is supported by the ISSN. So that's the International Society for Sports Nutrition. It is cited in their position paper all about protein. But what about us as female athletes? Are there different considerations here? So we need far more research on female athletes with regard to sports nutrition and exercise performance. According to the 2021 Invisible Sports Women study, only 6% of the sports and exercise studies conducted between the years of 2014 and 2020 were performed on female-only cohorts. So that means devoted specifically to studying women. We have a long way to go. There was a 2021 review done in the Journal of International Society of Sports Nutrition. Again, so that's JISSN, which is the journal for the ISSN, which covers female-specific recommendations, and it notes these key points. So let's keep this in mind. During the mid-luteal phase to the end of the cycle, the menstrual cycle, protein requirements may be higher due to an increase in protein oxidation. Some people out in the world turn this into a bad game of telephone and say things like you should double your protein intake in the luteal phase. Okay, hold your horses. Not necessarily. What I would translate this into is don't skimp out on your protein range during the middle of your luteal phase to the end of your cycle, especially. However, let's work on being more consistently hitting the range most of the time. Okay? I do not think that we should be stressing about eating in a different way on every single day of our cycle. It's just not practical. And it does not breed consistency and adherence, which are two of the things that are the most challenging anyway. We could probably have a whole podcast all about this and how we look at cycle syncing and all that other stuff. So maybe we'll do that in the future. And I can think of a couple amazing guests I might be able to invite to talk more about that. Also, during exercise in the mid-luteal phase, protein usage appears to be higher. More protein is used for building endometrial tissue in that mid-luteal phase. And this paper did conclude that female athletes may require general protein intakes of 1.6 to 2.0 grams per kilogram body weight per day. Okay, so that's like point, and again, it's not an exact conversion here, but it's roughly 0.8 to 1.0 grams per pound of body weight. Additionally, the estrogen fluctuation and eventual decline during perimenopause into postmenopause needs consideration, as I've already mentioned. So there's a strong case that could be made that female athletes over 40 should also aim toward the higher end of the range And I just stated what that range was, 1.6 to 2.0 grams per kilogram body weight per day. If you're somebody who is really struggling to keep muscle mass on your frame, it's very important that you are lifting, specifically lifting heavy enough, challenging enough weights at whatever rep and set range you do, and including enough dietary protein with some of the other considerations that we talk about further on in this series. All right, so we've covered actually a lot of ground in this podcast episode. We've talked more specifically about why protein is so important for us as female athletes, particularly female athletes over 40. We then discussed how to roughly calculate a protein intake range and looked at some of the science to back all of that up. I hope you found that this podcast was informative and useful for you. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on your podcast app. Share this out in Instagram stories and tag me, or send this podcast to a friend or a client or a colleague that you know could use this information. And if you're looking for support to turn this information into practice, to build accountability, to have expert guidance along the way and community at the same time, then I'm going to invite you to head over to stephgaudreau.com/apply and find out more about Strength Nutrition Unlocked, where we really help you to customize and put these practices into action so that you can build strength, add more muscle, have more energy, and perform better in and out of the gym. All right. Thank you so much for being with me today. Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll be covering more about protein in part 2 of this series. And until then, stay strong.